In the name of the Father, the Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Holy Spirit, guide our church as we seek new leadership in the pontificate of all. Amen. Amen. I've entitled our class tonight, The Age of Evangelization. Maybe we hear this word a lot, new evangelization, and things. Just to give you a little idea of where this word comes from. Evangelizer is a person who brings good news. In the ancient Greek world, I mean, before Jesus' time, city-states, unfortunately, were fighting each other all, Spartacus and Athens and all these stories we know about. There was a person, a slave, they were trained as runners to relay messages. And when they brought good news of victory of a battle, they were called the evangelizer. And when they proclaimed the victory, the response of the people was to set them free. They got their freedom. Unfortunately, on the other side, if they brought news of loss, they were sometimes even killed. So they said, beware of those who bring bad tidings. But this idea of being an evangelizer is a term that is captured by the church in this language to represent each one of us as baptized Christians, that we go out and we proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ, and it not only brings salvation to the world, but it also sets us free of our sins. So we are liberated from the slavery of sin as well. In this age what we're looking at, this is a big focus of the church. We've had the Council of Trent, which is dealing with the Protestant Reformation and the Reformation of the church, which is called the Counter-Reformation. So the Council of Trent clarifies very stringently almost what the church believes, what we believe about Jesus, what we believe about the sacraments, what we believe about everything. But it also sets in motion a reform. And a very critical one is that they established the seminary system to lift the educational level of the priests and the morals of the priests. So this is a new thing, that priests will be trained in seminaries. And there will be a curriculum or a ratio that every priest, we can assume, has a basic theological education and a philosophical education. So they're going to be taught how to think and then also have the content of the faith. That's a very, very critical reform because of so many variety of practices and abuses. The liturgy of the Mass, with some exceptions, will be celebrated the same way, what we call the Trinitine Mass. And the Council empowers the Pope to put this catechism out, which is an education, and it's meant for bishops, that they will have this reference to their teaching. And then we will see tonight how this gets onto the popular level as well. But after the Council of Trent, intended or not, it's a time of great lay development. People who are not hierarchs or who are, but they start to develop ways to enrich the religious life of the common people of the church. And with that comes spawning apostolic groups come out of those experiences. And it moves us towards the modern era. We're moving towards the modern world as this proceeds. And we spoke about some of the foundations, but in this development of the spirituality of the laity, there are four things that I wanted to point out, and I'll flesh these more. There's a development of spiritual writings geared for ordinary people. So there are things that you can read that will help you to deepen your spiritual life. There's a lot of production of this kind of material. We might call them prayer books or spiritual reading. Also at this time, there's a rise of mysticism, and a very strong focal point of this is in Spain. and it's part of the reform movements that are going on. There's a rising up of lay groups who do a lot of the powerful works of mercy, and in particular education and nursing and the care of orphans and things of this. And at this time, still, the Black Death will flare up, so you'll have people left without support. And then there's a flourishing of what we would call popular devotions. We've seen before, like pilgrimages become, but different devotions are associated with some of these movements, and they become very important to lay people as we move along. But if we go back to the foundation of the Jesuits in St. Ignatius Loyola, he develops a spiritual growth process, if you will, which he calls the spiritual exercises. They develop beginning in his own conversion experience at Manresa. He's sick. Yeah, as I mentioned before, he was very interested in kind of pornographic literature and stuff. But as he starts to change his life, he starts to read spiritual things, and he begins to write this kind of reflection, which is a set of meditations and, if you will, rules of spiritual growth. He completes this later in his life by the time he's founding the Jesuits, and it's often expressed in a 30-day retreat or an ongoing relationship with a spiritual director. The church had not known this kind of approach to spirituality until St. Ignatius, where a person would go to a mentor. Now, the monks had what they called Lectio Divino, where they would read a text of the Bible, and they would meditate on that, sometimes even repeat it, maybe a psalm, a verse of a psalm, and pray with that. The mendicants had an idea of spiritual companionship, where they would share with each other their experiences of prayer and things of this sort. But the idea that somebody was guided by someone else. Now, it takes variations, and some of it the spiritual director would kind of give you advice, kind of listen to you in your spiritual, and say, I think maybe you want to study this more or do this spiritual practice or something like that. In some forms of it, it was actually like an obedience. He told you, you will do this, and you will write this down, or you will say these prayers, and you were like controlled by that person. And it was done within the Society of Jesus. They had this practice, but they also spread this to the laity. And it had a real appeal because it had a real pattern. I mean, you could kind of grab onto it and go through this and deepen your spirituality. And it would take many forms. Over the years, many religious communities of women were founded for some work, but they would take this spirituality on for their community as well. And they would use this exercises. So he says that the purpose of man was created to praise, reverence, and serve our Creator and the Lord, and by this means to save his soul. And so it was intended for the Jesuits and for all the members of the church. And it's incredible the effect it has on the church at this time and to this present day, that people go on these retreats. The Jesuits sponsor a great deal of retreat houses where people go, and the retreats are based on these exercises that he develops. And these are not necessarily chronologically sequential, but another person that at this time, these are all post-Reformation people, is Francis de Sales. And he is a bishop in Geneva, Switzerland. And he has a lot of issues to deal with the Calvinists. And he's really articulate of trying to show the flaws in Calvinist approach to things. And so he's a fighter, if you will. He's willing to take on the opposition. But he also is concerned for the people of the church. And he writes this Introduction to the Divine Life in 1609. And in there, it's a process of deepening your prayer life. And it's a very simple process of meditations and spiritual practices, devotional, like saying so many Our Fathers and Hail Marys type of thing, little reminders, little prayers she could say during the day, and things of this sort. So it's a classic in the spiritual life. And then he writes this treatise on the love of God 7 years later. Again, it really is very, very influential among the people. It's accessible, where previously spiritual writings were either you had to read Latin or they're so highbrow that people couldn't figure them out. He also develops a spiritual and human friendship with this upper class lady. She becomes a saint later, Saint Frances de Chantal, and she founds the Order of the Visitation under his influence. Okay, and you're going to see a pattern here that men get ideas and women implement them. But what is unique about the Order of the Visitation, at this time, if you became a religious of any kind, were a woman, you had to be enclosed. They were always cloistered. They weren't out to work in the world. But what he is developing is the idea that they will have their monastery of their sisters, the cloister, the convent, but they will have a school attached to it, and they will run a school. And they are like the Academy of the Visitation. You might have heard of some of these things. And the Ursulines had done something similar earlier by St. Angela Merrienboer. And so now nuns who are usually just contemplative and lived a monastic life inside are doing apostolic work. And so mainly teaching and nursing they're doing. So, but they're still hooked up into this cloister. So after school, back in the house, they don't go out. And he develops a lot of prayer and devotional things that the sisters are going to do. And their prayer is truncated, where the nuns would say all the prayers of the Liturgy of the Hours and have many other. The nuns' prayer would be truncated so they could teach and they could prepare the classes and things like that. So it's a blend of kind of cloister, but it's more and more becoming apostolic. And so that's a new kind of model, and we're going to see more and more religious women become big players in the church in terms of education, nursing, all kinds of social services. Charles Borromeo, who's the Bishop of Milan in the north, he takes up this command of the council. He's charged by Pius V to draft this new catechism, this catechism of Trent. But he doesn't just stop there in producing this catechism. He starts to make popular versions of this catechism, where the faith is going to be taught to us by a question and answer process. And looking around here, some of you may know that.
Yes, we do.
Why did God make you?
God made me to know Him and love Him and serve Him.
And next, okay, absolutely.
More catechism.
Exactly. Well, that's a later version of this idea that you're training people into these things. Now, it has a double function. It helps them to know their faith, but it also helps them to defend their faith. They know what the church teaches, so there can be less possibilities of being infected by heretical movements called Protestants. And so he develops this kind of process. And so you're having schools are developing, and it's an easy tool that even somebody not trained in the faith can use. You can just teach it like that, And like I said, and that was in the immigrant church in the United States, that was a significant tool of catechizing us. And there's a distinction in language. You'll hear people talk about catechizing, and the other is theologizing. What you are having in these classes is theology. You're being taught what the church teaches and how they come to that and different variations of it. Catechesis is giving people the basic facts. And children, if a person isn't catechized, it's difficult to theologize with them, because it's like, you're going to become a doctor, first you have to take those horrible anatomy classes and stuff. And then once you know the parts of the body, then you can start talking about pathologies and how to cure it. And so that was the process the church used. Until the mid-1950s, the view was that most lay people needed to be catechized. It's only in the 1950s that Catholic colleges in our country start teaching theology. But there were just higher levels of catechisms. You just kept on going to higher and higher levels. And it's in the really the late 1940s, after World War II, that Catholic colleges start to teach theology to the college students there, including women who were taught that. He also develops a whole process of pious devotions and renewal. So things like missions. He develops this idea that I said that parishes will have these revivals. And part of his revival is these penitential processions. They're very penitential, aren't they? That, like in Lent, people would process through the street. They would carry statues that resembled parts of the Passion, Jesus carrying the cross. The Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Sorrows starts to become a big devotion at this time. He also develops in the mountainous regions of northern Italy little pilgrimages of the life of Christ. And you go there, it's really worth seeing it. They're like little churches, say maybe about this much of the room. And you go inside, and life-size statues of like the Annunciation, you have Angel Gabriel and Mary in there, and it's painted a whole scene in her room and everything. And there's a little place where you can kneel, and you can stay there in quiet. You look at the scene, and you imagine yourself at the Annunciation, and like, what would be your reaction, and what do you think about all this, and do you understand that God became one of us? And then you go through a whole life of Christ, and as you're going up the mountain, of course, you're starting to go into the Passion. At the top is usually the crucifixion, and then you start to come down, and there's the burial, and then the empty tomb. And each of these places, so it was like a private journey retreat. And these places, and they're beautiful, the statues are made of beautiful ceramic. They're very works of art. And then they have the sky painted and the scenes and everything. It's really cool to do it. And right now, for some reason, in recent years, it has become very popular for backpackers to do these things up in northern Italy there. And, you can camp out if you do it over a few days or whatever. But he was a big one for that. And the Black Plague hits Milan. Many people are dying. And he preaches this is like a punishment for us for our sins, and we have to repent. So he was really a big force in the Counter-Reformation. And he was made a cardinal. That's why he's all dressed up like in red. So another movement that goes on in Spain, if you recall, I said looking at the council, one of the things it said, religious orders had to reform themselves. And many of them were in grave need of reform. In Spain, the Carmelite nuns, who again were cloistered, remember they didn't have schools, they had become quite comfortable. It was very common for an upper-class young lady to enter the convent and bring a servant with her, a personal maid, and who would tend to her needs. And they lived quite a nice life. And they wouldn't leave the convent, but they would have visitors. They were very worldly for cloistered nuns, And Teresa of Avila, who actually was in that same kind of lifestyle, she enters that. She becomes the head of a convent, and she is inspired through prayer and mystical experience to start to reform the Carmelite order. And she develops what we call the Descalced Carmelites. They would wear no shoes and very, very strict observance. And she reforms her convent, and then she starts reforming convents all over, and she starts to reform the Carmelite order. A companion of hers is John of the Cross, and she really instigates that he reformed the friars, the Carmelite friars, in the same way. And so today you have you have the Carmelites and you have the Descalced Carmelites, so they're the reformed group. All the men didn't join up on this. But not only are they reformers, they're mystics. And they write on the advice of their confessors these spiritual chronologies of their experiences, and also treatises on how to grow in faith and charity. Teresa writes in particular for her nuns. She's a very earthy, down-to-earth lady. There's some marvelous quotes about her. When she's going from one convent to the other trying to reform them, she's in a wagon, and the wagon wheel breaks in a river. And she's frustrated. She says to God, "Why are you doing this to me?" And she hears the voice saying, "Well, this is the way I treat my friends." And she says, "Now, why do you have so few friends?" But the best one for her in the way of perfection is she's given advice to her nuns. And she says, if you ask a sister to help you in the kitchen, and she says to you, "I can't because I'm praying," she's a liar. She said, because prayer and service are always connected. And so she wasn't into silly, lazy mysticism. She was very, very practical. And she writes this incredible book. And if you look in Western classics and books or stuff, you'll find it there, The Interior Castle, where she really talks about how we grow deeper in our relationship with Jesus. And she has many mystical experiences. She goes into ecstasy. You'll see here she's got this golden arrow, which Jesus sends an angel to pierce her heart with. It's a symbol of his love for her. Bernini does an incredible statue that's in Rome of her. It's one of the great Baroque classics of her. But she's writing these writings, and they're not only inspiring the Carmelite nuns, but especially it's catching the imagination of holy women. Women are reading these things, and they're being inspired to new ways of understanding their faith. So what you're having is a growth of women through these schools and stuff in terms of education. Another movement we see is Vincent de Paul, who is really, in the church, we'll see it in the next class, how the church in France is really classist. There's different levels in the clergy. And Vincent de Paul really is a chaplain to wealthy people. But over time, he begins to question, is he finding really the face of Christ in all this? And he decides to move into the slum area of Paris, and it's very, very hard for him. It's such a different world for him. But he persists in his conversion. And this very wealthy woman, Louise de Marillac, he convinces her that she should join his project. Because he has a double vision. He's going to found a group of men, priests, called the Congregation of the Missions, and they'll have two purposes: to go onto foreign missions and to run the seminaries for the diocesan clergy. It's a major work of theirs. And he convinces her to gather a group of women together who will not be religious. They will not take vows. They'll take promises. That way they don't have to stay in the convent, in the cloister. They'll be able to go into the tenements, into the streets, and serve the people. To this day, the Daughters of Charity take a promise every year. They never take a life vow, and they can leave any time. But they're not the type of religious like I am or others. And the idea was this was a way to get them out of the stricture of the cloister, the convent. They had to be inside. And him and others, this is a whole different way of thinking about religious life. And this is most of the nuns and daughters and stuff that she knew running schools and hospitals, they come out of this period. It's a whole new way of serving the church. And many of them don't want to get under the control of the church. They want to be like movements. Many of them wind up being like the Sisters of Mercy. Mother Macaulay is just ultimately the bishops say, you've got to be under us. That they were lay movements, they were lay women. And the garb they wore was what lay people wore. Now, Louisa never wore the coronet, but the Daughters of Charity wore the peasant garb of women in Normandy and Britain, that kind of, what they used to call this cornetto they had on. If you ever see pictures of it, not like the Rhino and real. My sisters had them in high school, and they were coming off their head. And they just took a secular dress on. They didn't have a habit. Over time, when they became more under canonical control, then that became their habit. They had to wear that as they went along. But the idea was to be out with the people. And there'll be many different foundations. They also would promote popular devotions. Devotion very much associated with them is the miraculous medal. A woman that was in their community, a daughter of St. Catherine Labouré, had visions of Our Lady under the title of the miraculous medal, and it's very common. We don't have one here, but it's Mary with her arms out like that. You know, it's a very common statue of Mary. I think the new statue of Mary at Sacred Heart is that. I'm not sure. I think so. And they would promote this devotion of wearing the green scapula or the miraculous medal. Some of you are familiar with that. I think the shrine of it's in Perryville, Missouri, but here in the States. So it's all this fermentation. So you can see it's a really lively time. And but a lot of this is focused on Europe. But meanwhile, the church is expanding out. It's expanding out in the Americas, and now it's into Asia, and in a very limited way in Africa. The Catholic missions in Africa are much later. It's really in the 19th and 20th century that the focus is on Africa. There's more Asia and the Americas. But if you recall, when Christopher Columbus and friends discover the Americas, the Pope gives the king of Spain and Portugal command of this. He tells them, you have this mandate. You have to fund the church. You have to appoint the bishops and all of this stuff. Now that's in like 1510. By the time we get to 1622, there's been a lot of ups and downs with that mandatum. And the Pope institutes an organization at the Vatican level called the Propaganda dei Fidi. Today we call it the Congregation of the Evangelization of People. Propaganda means promotion in Latin, and fide, the promotion of the faith. And it has a charge is they're going to take care of the missionary activity. And the mandate is quite extensive. They're going to set policy on how the mission should be conducted. They're going to govern the policy. And I brought a little book here. It has a quote I wanted to read to you. I don't like to make people suffer through text being read to them. But the propaganda issues in 1659. It says, do not regard it as your task, and do not bring any pressure to bear on people to change their manners, customs, and usages, unless they are evidently contrary to religion and sound morals. What could be more absurd than to transport France, Spain, Italy, or some other European country to China or elsewhere? Do not introduce all that to them, but only the faith, which does not despise or destroy the manners and customs of any people, always supposing that they are not evil, but rather wishes to see them preserved unharmed. It is the nature of man to love and to treasure above all else their own country and that which belongs to it. In consequence, there is no stronger cause of alienation and hate than to attack on local customs, especially when they go back to a venerable antiquity. This is more especially the case when an attempt is made to introduce the customs of another people in place of those that have been abolished. Do not draw invidious contrasts between the customs of the people and those of Europe. Do your utmost to adapt yourself to them. So they're saying it's not about colonialism, it's about sharing the faith. Because in fact, what was going on in the missions is they were making little French people, little Spanish people out of the people. Well-intentioned, but it was going on. Once when I was in charge of our missions, there was the 100th anniversary of our missionaries in the Republic of Congo. And I went there and they were like, what was it like 100 years ago? And this old gentleman who was the son of one of the first catechists, and that was often they would train catechists who then would help the missionaries. He said it was like this. He said there was a place where there were beautiful monkeys. They were gray, and they had white fur and gold fur. And where they lived, they had everything. They had all the food that they would ever want. But they didn't have water, so they had to go down to this river. and get water. And they noticed when they would do that, there were fish there in the water, and that's all they had was water. And they felt sorry for them, so they took them out of the water and brought them to their land. And the fish protested and died. But the monkeys wanted to share what they had with them. And that's what had happened there, that the Belgian friars who went there tried to make them into Belgians. And the people suffocated under that, you know. So that was their little story. So there's this big effort. Now this is almost 125 years after the discovery of the Americas to start to rectify some of the things that had taken place. They would direct the new mission territories. They would decide who would where, no longer with Spain. And in fact, they have a reverse mission thing. So for example, if the English took over a place, they would send missionaries from another country. So it would be clear if they weren't part of the colonial process. If the Dutch had colonies, they would send another country, and they would always mix them and match them like that. You know, so, and sometimes it was horrendous. You'd have like an English colony that sent Irish, so they would clearly not be mixed up. You know, and so they're trying to separate kind of this decision to let Spain and Portugal run the missions. Now they're kind of stepping back and trying to unravel the process. They will appoint the bishops, no longer the king or queen. So you're going to have bishops who are going to follow a church party line, not royal party line. And they're given wide mandate by the Pope to interpret church laws and practices in a generous way, and determine kind of what's called jux the modum, in the spirit of the law. So many things that would be allowed, not allowed in Europe, would be allowed on the missions because it wasn't possible. And remember, after Trent, the Mass and all those things were going to be defined very, very strictly. That the wine had to have 12% alcohol. Only linen could be used for the cloth. Gold vessels had to be used. All these things were spelled out very, again, just the church of our childhood, those of us who were in the 70 bracket. And what would you do on the missions? Where are we going to get all this stuff? Well, jux de modum, you did as that. You used white cloth, or, that type of thing. There was a lot of flexibility in the missions. And during this time, many missionary communities, if they had kind of upstarts and who were questioning things, go to the missions and you'll be free and you can do your thing out there. And the missions became very creative places, but Europe became very rigid in many ways. The creativity in Europe was being drained off there. And it was run by 13 cardinals, 2 prelates, and a secretary. That was the staff. The cardinals would meet periodically as a policy, and these 2 prelates and the secretary really ran the show. 3 people was really the operation. And the oversight was these 3 cardinals. But it will change the way missions are approached. And something that will linger on well into the 20th century. But the question of developing a local clergy, so this just changes. Now the goal of the missionary is to establish a local church. So it's to get men and women to become priests and nuns and the bishop and all that, and establish a Nigerian church or a Ghanaian church or a Peruvian church. But there are some obstacles that come along with it. The Spanish and Portuguese had embraced a policy, not from the government, from the missionary institutes, of what they called the pure blood. So they would not accept Latin Americans into religious life in the priesthood that they had any kind of Indian blood or black blood. And this would prevail in some places. In the Philippines, it continues until 1933. That if anybody had a speck of Filipino blood in them, they weren't pure Spanish, they could not be promoted to the altar. They would allow them to be brothers and sisters sometime, but priests, no way. And so, of course, that makes those churches dependent on missionaries. And that's one of the reasons to this day in Latin America there's a great shortage of priests, because it's only in recent years they've been promoting local vocations. So this is going to be challenged, but it's not going to be forbidden. the practices of these institutes. And so they always are looking back to Spain to send more missionaries. But then there are other groups of missionaries that are these new groups that are forming, and they have a reverse policy. They will not accept anybody into their congregation. They have to become local priests. So an example in the United States is the Merrienboer order. The Merrienboers will go everywhere, but if you're say like from Venezuela and you want to be a Merrienboer, no, you have to become a priest for Venezuela. Their goal is to establish local churches, and this, there's two different approaches going on within the missions, but it affects the way the church develops. In places where this is, you'll see the church is much more colonial, much more like Spain and Portugal, where these are being developed. They have more of a local flavor, and these are the groups that, and again, I don't know how good your memory is, but the real senior members of our class. But do you remember the Missa Luba that was developed? That it was in Latin, the Mass was in Latin, but they used African rhythm. They go, Kyrie, and beating on drums and things like this. Those were the groups that were doing these things. This group who were trying to develop more meaningful. They were still saying the Mass in Latin and everything, facing the wall, but they were beating drums and singing. So that was quite innovative. By today's standards, you'd say, well, they haven't been to our boom by God masses, but at that time it was quite innovative. But the new focus of the missions will be Asia. Now this, I got off the internet, this map, but the Spanish base in Asia was the Philippines, and till this day it's still the most Christian and Catholic country in Asia is the Philippines. I mean, it's overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. And it's from Asia that many of the missionaries will branch out. But there's also, the Jesuits had come around, and their first, St. Francis Xavier had landed in Goya in India, and a Christian church was established there, and then also in the south in Kerala. But by tradition, in a place called Madras, there was a very ancient Christian community called the St. Thomas Christians that claimed they were founded by the Apostle Thomas. And I don't know if you've ever thought of that, but when we look at the scripture and the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of St. Paul, we get the picture of how Christianity was going west, but we don't have any authoritative documents saying how the church went east. So it could be, there's different views if it's really historically. And then some of the Jesuits ventured out to get to China. But in general, the outreach was like to Japan, to China, and Vietnam. All three of those cultures had a philosophical view of things. And the missionaries were able to engage them intellectually, so they were very attractive to those countries. But other countries which were not as philosophical, they were less engaged there. They did not promote that as much. So Christianity comes much later to, like today, what we call Indonesia and places like this. So it starts to expand out, but because these are sophisticated cultures and they have a sense, especially China's the center of the universe, and they have Confucianism and they have traditions, there's a number of persecutions, and a lot of Christian missionaries are martyred there, and their converts are martyred. So Vietnam, Korea, Japan, China, there's a lot of martyrs associated with the Christian movement as they go forth. But it also has a real big setback. Actually, somebody who was in class this morning said they knew a professor who was an expert on it at Mizzou. But this inculturation issue about not bringing Europe, but bringing the faith, comes to a boiling point. The question is, what's the faith and what's secondary to it? What is the core? And it comes to a head between the Jesuits and the Dominicans. And it's over the Chinese rites. What is the Chinese rites? People who held any kind of level of public office service in China were required to take an oath or go through a rite. And in this rite, there was like a pledge of allegiance, but there was also a kind of a reverence to the ancestors. And this was construed by some of the missionaries as ancestor worship, idolatry. And others said, no, it's this kind of a civil, cultural thing. The Dominicans held that it was idolatry. The Jesuits said, no, it's a cultural thing. And they square off on this thing. The implication being, if it is idolatry, the Christian community in these very developed societies culturally are going to be cut off from the main streams of culture. They're not going to be able to be in any kind of leadership role in society because they can't do this. This thing gets really hot. I mean, it's not just a theoretical debate. It gets to be really bad. And there's an incident that happens at Macau, which is a Portuguese colony. And this thing is cooking up a storm, and it's getting violent. And the Jesuits get some military people with them and some other people, and they decide to storm the Dominican church. The Dominicans, in defense, lock the church up, and they put the monstrance with the hose in the window. And so when the troops get there to take possession, they said, well, what are we going to do? In the Blessed Sacrament, and they said, genuflect, then shoot them. And I mean, this is really true. And this incident that happens at Santo Domingo in Macau, and the church is still there, and there's a big memorial of this, finally gets Rome's attention. So Pope Clement XI sends a legate there, and in this church where the shootout was, they have this big session. And the Pope legate sides with the Dominicans and he puts everybody under a command of silence. That no longer could Dominicans or Jesuits discuss this in here. And it had other implications. In China, the vestment colors meant something. Weddings were done in red, funerals were done in white, and the Jesuits would go along with it. They would do the funerals with white vestments. The Dominicans had them good black outfits on, and the white for the weddings and stuff like that. So you can imagine if you're a Chinese bride, you come in and the priest is wearing mourning clothes, and it was out of sync. Today it's so obvious. At that time, it wasn't so obvious to these well-intentioned, passionate missionaries. But ultimately, the decision, which was a bad one and historical, set the development of Christianity in Asia, and in particular in China, back centuries, because it was perceived as a foreign idea coming to China. It wasn't something that could become Chinese. Christianity, Christ could not incarnate into China because of this. And it set the whole thing back. And the silence was imposed on us, and it was not lifted until 1939. If before that, I wouldn't have mentioned this in class. I didn't have to speak of it at all. Isn't that something? But Pius XII spoke of this, and he reflects and said, we've got to go in a different direction. And he's kind of reversing this. And he's going to allow experimentation with the liturgy and stuff in these places, and use of the different colors and things of this sort. But the Jesuits had won the great confidence of the emperor and the intellectual community of China. Actually, many of them were buried in the imperial palace, the secret palace, And if you go to China today, just outside the wall of the Forbidden City, a number of Jesuits are buried there. They had that much confidence. And they put on the clothes of Chinese clothes. They wore the Chinese secular clothes. So they were much more into this at the time. And but it holds back the development of the church there. And like I said, it's really until the 19th century that some of these things are starting. In the United States, the church is very slow developing. The main Catholic communities are in Maryland, which is a Catholic colony, which does not have religious freedom. Only Catholics can be there. And in Rhode Island, which does have a policy of freedom of religion. So Catholics will settle in Rhode Island and then in Maryland. And and it's in that colony of Maryland that the first bishop of the United States is appointed, just about the time of the Declaration of Independence. John Carroll is the first bishop. Right away, the Catholic Church in the United States has to defend the American experiment, because the Catholic Church had held this: every country should be a Catholic country. The idea of separation of church and state. These are very, very controversial issues and will not really be resolved until the Second Vatican Council. That it was just so far into the European mentality, where you had emperors protecting the church and kings, this idea for them. And one of the solutions was the early bishops of the United States had a policy to stay away from Rome at all costs. They only sent to Rome what they absolutely had to do, because they didn't want it. They didn't feel like they were being received well. Rome's response was to take European bishops and send them over. But like the first bishop of New York dies on the way, and then the second bishop arrives and he lasts a couple of years and dies and something like that. So their idea is put foreign bishops here, but ultimately it doesn't work in American bishops. But there's this view of the United States keeping a respectful distance from them so that we could survive. Also in the United States, on the West Coast, you have the whole mission movement of the Franciscans, especially led by Juniper Serra, who they develop a system of these missions which has an educational schools, farming, and they're also using it for conversions as a base for evangelization. But missions are somewhat controversial, because while they helped people and protected the Native Americans, they also in some ways stripped the people of their culture, especially through education. They were losing their language and their cultural practices. But from the Baja all the way up, there's this whole string of missions that are founded up and down the coast there. So Catholicism gets a big hold on the West Coast, which will be ultimately the state of California. Also in New Mexico. So in New Mexico, we have the oldest diocese there, Santa Fe. And also there was a Spanish settlement in Florida, St. Augustine. And so you really have different developments of Catholicism, which will ultimately, with the expansion of the country, merge into one church. But Catholicism is moving very slow. It's a Protestant country. It's very, very hard for Catholics to practice their faith outside of Maryland. There's a lot of anti-Catholicism. And in fact, when the church is starting to, in the immigrant period, there's just blatant discrimination and real harassment. Their priests and religious sisters are murdered on some occasions. Churches are burnt and things of this sort. So that early history of Catholicism in the United States is very shaky. And there's great fears of Romanism coming into the United States there. So our development is much, much slower. We're a very young church. And it's not until 1910 that we're declared by the Vatican not to be a missionary church. Right? We get moved from the propaganda de fide to the congregation of bishops. But prior to that time, we had jux demotum. A lot of things could be done. So priests rode circuit and wore tuxedos, and just a lot of different things that today we would find kind of peculiar. There was a lot of freedom in the development of the church. Also, a lot of kind of unsavory characters were sent over to be missionaries. People would empty out their monasteries or their dioceses with troubled people and send them over. And so there was a lot of shenanigans going on too in the church business at that time. Another movement will begin. In terms of theological questions, there continues to be conflicts between Protestants and Catholics. And in some cases, it breaks out into religious wars. But there's constantly this kind of an aggression and intolerance on both sides of the religious spectrum. And so ever so often there's big flare-ups in Europe. And the Treaty of Westphalia has supposedly solved it if your king or emperor was a Catholic, you were a Catholic. If you was a Protestant, you were a Protestant. That was the way they had tried to solve it. But in fact, that did not happen. So you have in England almost aggressive suppression of the church, and it takes on horrendous expressions in Ireland, the destruction of churches, the confiscation of church property and things like that. These things would constantly flare up. The questions of human rights and slavery become much more paramount. That can human beings be chatteled? And it's raised more and more. And it's coming from the mission lands, it's coming from the base up. It's not officially, slavery is not condemned until 1893, finally, formally by the church. But the notion of human rights, and we'll see this more next class, when this gets mixed in with the French Revolution, Catholicism becomes very weary of it. But prior to the French Revolution, Catholicism was a promoter of the idea of this innate dignity of the human person and rights that flowed from that. So you had kind of a forward thinking, and then we're going to see a reaction set in after the French Revolution. But clearly the biggest theological problem that arises is he lives in Belgium. He's a Flemish Belgian. Cornelis Janssen is his name. He lived 1585 to 1638. And he develops a theological view which will be called Jansenism. It'll be condemned by the church formally as a heresy that Catholics cannot embrace. And it spreads through Catholicism more than a flu or virus. It's just all over the place. And it will continue to infect the church to this present day because it becomes subtly introduced into different areas. He has a very pessimistic view of human nature, and he denies the freedom of the will, that the human person in its inherent identity is always going to go toward evil, that we're just kind of programmed that way, that we're always going to make bad choices, that the human person is basically corrupt. And so things that the church was given by Christ to shore up the church, like the Eucharist, he claimed that only a very few people were worthy to go to the Eucharist. So he discouraged people to go to communion. And if they did want to go to communion, he would insist that you went to confession before you went to communion. And we don't bump into that as much in ministry. But in my childhood, there were many adults who would never go to communion unless they could go to confession on Saturday right before. You always had to go before.
Saturday confession.
Yeah, and it was like, it was, the two went together. You could never just go to communion every day type of thing.
And there'd be long lines.
Oh, yeah.
Long lines.
Yeah. But the thing, what he was really, was like that you could not trust yourself. You were always like under moral suspicion, and guilt was a big part of his theme, and so it was like a guilt motivator, and you couldn't, so the confessor was the one who really decided if he had committed the sin, and he'd say, well, I did this, but I kind of did that, and the priest would kind of do this thing, and they believe in a very harsh and rigorous moral lifestyle, especially penances and things like that. They like fast, very hard fast, and things of this sort. And it moves into France, and then it just flourishes in the Netherlands. It's just a beautiful blend of Calvinism there. They just really go for it big time. And later on, it gets to Ireland. And why does it get to Ireland? Because many of the clergy in exile are studying in Belgium, the Netherlands, and they're becoming priests, and then they're going to Ireland after because the church is suppressed there. And this gets into kind of like almost like a scrupulous way of looking at spirituality. And it's a real setback. Now, if you can remember when the mendicants were founded and the scholasticism was the view that was prevailing, people like Bonaventure and Aquinas and Scotus would say, if you're basically a good person, you're habitus, your habits are good, and you come to a moral decision, trust your intuitions. because habitually you've been choosing good things. So odds are this habit's going to again be there. And if you're a person who makes rotten decisions, then you should go seek the counsel of a wise and good person to guide you. But if you're basically a good person, you make your moral decisions. Jansenism would never, ever condescend. You always have to go to the priest and this and that and the other. And you'll still, I mean, if you look at what our church teaches about committing sin, people will come in sometimes, less so today, and say, I want to ask you, do you think I committed a sin? Well, you can't commit a sin retroactively. You have to know it, will it, and so forth. It's either grave or not grave. But, I mean, you can't say, well, last week, I'm not sure if that was a sin or not. Well, if you're that doubt, in true doubt, it can't be a sin. But they would always be checking with us. When I was a young brother, all the people were I just want to check with you. And a very good friend, God bless her, she's in the grave. But her and her husband had 5 children. And she had some kind of medical problem in her reproductive organs. And the doctor told her she needed a hysterectomy. And so, she knew what the church taught about all that stuff. So she goes to this Dominican priest, who was kind of a curmudgeon. We didn't really like him. But she goes to him, and it just so happened it was his day on calls to answer the door. So she comes in and she said, Father, I'd like to talk to you. I have this medical problem. The doctor said I should have a hysterectomy, and I wanted to ask you, can I do it? I said, what the hell are you asking me for? Go to the doctor. I'm not a doctor. And later on, she told me, she said it was the most liberating thing. So we were afraid to do anything without the priest. Okay, you have to check with the priest. I mean, what the heck do I know about gynecology? If the doctor says do it, go do it. But she always delighted in retelling that story. And she said, well, I thought now it's time for me to grow up and make some decisions. But this Jansenism takes hold, and it in particular affects religious life of women. It becomes really a big power in the religious life of women. And many women suffered under that terribly because it was always somebody else deciding your life. You were stayed in a spiritual infantile state. You're like all those little children, and then the parents were kind of governing you. And within this view, the greatest virtue of all was obedience to authority. Obedience. And so it becomes very legalistic type of a way of living the Christian life. And it comes into the 20th century. It's still, you will find this in there. And you realize the missionaries are coming out from all these places and they're bringing it to other parts. But that's kind of an internal issue in the church. But the Enlightenment, the age of reason, is developing from a different philosophical view, rooted in the whole idea of the scientific method, the modern scientific method, where you employ observation, experimentation, and reason things out. This kind of view, which was advancing many, many things in society, making life better, in medicine and all kinds of technology would be thought to be birthed out of this scientific method, which was standing on philosophical views like Hume and Voltaire and people like this. They began to expand this idea to all knowledge, and when they applied this to issues of faith, it led to kind of a practical atheism, because you could not, through observation, experimentation, and reason, prove the truths of faith. They're ultimately a mystery. Now that can make people crazy. When I taught in the seminary, we would go just deep into some of the teachings of the church, and we said, and they would be perplexed. And over time, they realized, and I go, then when we get to the certain point, they would all say at one time, "Because it's a mystery," because that would be my bottom line answer, that we're dealing with the mysteries of faith. But they held that the teachings of the church were under suspicion, and they really questioned authority which they understood the authority of the church as inhibiting the intellectual development of society. And there were practices by the Inquisition and others that reinforced that view. So the Enlightenment becomes a view in total opposition to religion. And now here I'm saying religion, that's Protestantism as well as Catholicism. They were all under attack because they were all based on the supposition of the mystery of faith. And so they see religion as really a counterforce, a fetter on human progress, because they're strongly committed to social improvement of the secular society. And philosophically, doubt would replace faith. Doubt would raise questions which would then develop discovery. We would start to expand out. And that's true. We have questions, we dig into it, and it is an engine behind social progress. But it's going to find itself in conflict with the church. And the big celebrated case of this faith versus reason argument is the case of Galileo. Galileo, he was an Italian astronomer and mathematician, comes from Pisa. Many of his experiments were on the Tower of Pisa. He was working with things like gravity and so forth. Copernicus had published this book, The Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, in 1543. And it was put immediately on the index of books, forbidden books by the church. And only after it was reviewed by theologians and revised was it allowed to be published. This dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, which was dealing with the rotation of the earth around the sun and things of this sort, and actually the earth itself rotating, these different theories, okay? But had been modified greatly in order. Why would the church care so much about this? Because they saw the shift that the sun was the center of things, and we were in some way subject to that. It destabilized the whole worldview of the human person being the center of creation, and everything was surrounding us. So the earth had to be the center of everything, because we were the center of creation, and everything in existence existed for us. So all of a sudden now, we're not the center of this physical world, but something else far away from us we're rotating around it, and it just changed the whole worldview. And it wasn't that they said it was wrong, it was just they felt it was inopportune. It wasn't the right time to be talking about these things, And you still hear that sometimes. They'll say, well, we're going to, well, the people aren't ready for that. The real emphasis is not ready for it, But in 1633, he's called before the Inquisition to explain these writings, these theories that he has. Galileo is no low or easy person, and he digs his heels in. He's brought into a room which shows him all the instruments of torture and kind of intimidates him, and he's compelled to recant his theory that the earth is not going around the sun and all these things. And he's put under house arrest. And he's allowed to continue his research and everything, but he can't publish anything. His writings are very carefully watched. But his daughter is a Carmelite nun, and he writes to her, and it's I always say, it's the typical example of male versus female. Her letters to him are lost. Probably threw them away after he read them. But she kept all of his letters, and they're published in a book. You can read about it. And you can see his integrity as a scientist, but also kind of a personality that likes a good scrap, And so this combination gets him in trouble. And it's not until 1992 that John Paul II declares that the church had really erred in his judgment of his works, that he was not treated well in that. But it's a case I bring it up because it's often when people who attack the church as being anti-intellectual, anti-science will bring up this case. And it was a missed opportunity. As you see, there are many missed opportunities in the church. The Chinese rites was not a good thing to do. But we hang on to this for ideological reasons, because today the church is paramount in the education and the intellectual life of society. Things move on. But he gets himself into some hot water with these people. And they are of the conviction, and it's something of this age that we don't always understand. In this world that they're living in, they take ideas seriously, and they appreciate the impact of ideas. And sometimes I don't think we do today realize that philosophical and theological positions have impacts upon people. You know? If you think of somebody like Karl Marx, who just writes a lot of theory. I mean, he never starts up a revolution, goes around and kills people. But think of how Marxism has shaped the 20th century, a theory. And the church takes intellectual ideas seriously. And in this age, where there's the split within Christianity between the Protestants and the Catholics, new cultures, all these things are encountering one another, that the church becomes very, very concerned about ideas. And in the next place, you'll see how, as the French Revolution happens in the industrial age, that Catholicism becomes extremely reactionary. And there's a really closing of the mind of the church, which will exist for almost 150 years. That there is really a kind of, if you will, forming again, and that we develop a separate society. And in your own life, you might have experienced that we had our own society separate from, you know, the Catholic parish was a society to itself. You know, they have the Masons, we have the Knights of Columbus, they have this, we have that, and we stayed within this world. We didn't mix with different people. And it's, even so, within our lifetime, and if you had a Jewish friend and they were getting married to Jewish people, you couldn't go to the ceremony of Lutherans. You couldn't go into their ceremonies. And so that we became very cut apart, and we'll see how that occurs, and then how the pressure builds up, and then ultimately new energy bursts out at the Second Vatican Council. But in spite of a lot of these things that we can say are regrettable in the church, don't depreciate the fact that ideas are serious. Ideas are serious. And ideas shape our lives, and the church takes them seriously. And so sometimes you hear about different ideas being challenged because ideas are serious. And sometimes young people don't understand that so much, and they need to be educated in a classical way to realize that philosophical ideas shape our reality. And today, there is a philosophical view of the way the human person relates and all this new technology and things like that. But we don't step back from it and analyze it and say, what are the assumptions, the presuppositions that are saying this is the way we should live, this is what human relationships are about, and this is what social institutions are about. At this time in the history of the church, they're very preoccupied with this. They're very concerned about how ideas are shaping the world around us. And there's this incredible burst of activity. Lay people are never as educated in the faith as in this period. The Catholic people understand their faith more. They're spiritual, and they're encouraged to pray more. They're more and more are practicing pious devotions. People are wearing scapulars and medals and going to novenas and all these kind of practices to enrich their spirituality. Maybe by today's standards we'd say, well, it's not for us today, or maybe it is for us today. But what it did was that the ordinary lay people had a foundation of their faith which previously they never had. And so that was a big burst of this age of evangelization. And never again would the laity be so uncatechized. And a great deal of this is due to religious women who just embrace education and from the cradle began to educate the Catholic community. And if you look in this country, the Catholic community is one of the most educated populations in this country. We're very literate people. And so, but even with the missteps, there are successes as it comes along. So, as always in church history, there's this mixed story as it goes along. And just as a reminder, our next class will be on March the 21st, at the same time, same channel.